Hello and welcome back to the channel. So today I wanted to come on camera and talk about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is empaths and what attachment style they have. So I recently did another video, and that was about narcissists and attachment, and basically outlining the fact that they don't have an attachment style, and that's because, well, they don't attach. So I guess today is really a follow-up video in a way about empaths and their attachment style, what kind of attachment style empaths tend to have, whether there is a dominant attachment style attached to the majority of empaths. So I guess I really wanted to start with just a bit of a definition of what an empath is. And I guess I want to make it clear as well that empath isn't actually an official diagnosed term. So when we look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, or the DSM for short, that's basically a manual of all the recognized psychological mental health disorders, and empath does not feature in the DSM, whereas NPD, or narcissistic personality disorder, definitely does. It falls under the category of cluster B personality disorders. So it is actually a diagnosable, recognized official personality disorder, and is essentially recognized as a mental health issue or a mental illness. So empath is not, though. Empath is a term that a lot of people use, and I think it's becoming a lot more accessible and mainstream. I've noticed that, even a lot of psychologists, people in the medical field, people in the helping professions, counselors are using the term empath a lot more in their practice. And it's definitely something that is very widespread on the internet. So a lot of videos, a lot of blog articles, a lot of content in general that talks about empaths. And so I think it's becoming a lot more mainstream, essentially. And, I identify myself as an empath, even though it's not a diagnosable term. I guess I am a lot more open-minded as a therapist, as a clinician, and I tend to embrace a lot of different understandings of things, not just psychological, not just clinical mental health understandings, but also spiritual understandings, also things from personality testing as well. Personality testing like the Myers-Briggs personality test, for example, which is very well known. I don't think it's considered, still, it's not considered mainstream psychology. A lot of psychologists might not use it, or even think that it's not necessarily official enough, so to speak. And, to be fair, it is a tool. It's just another tool to understand personality, cognitive functions, where people tend to fall on the spectrum of those things. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's another framework to use. But again, I've found that incredibly helpful on my own journey of understanding myself. And so, all of these things, I think, can be considered equally, not just the clinically proven mental health diagnoses or jargon or the psychological concepts. So I really wanted to start with that, and then really kind of talk about where empaths might generally tend to fall on the attachment style spectrum. So, for those who aren't familiar with attachment theory and attachment styles, there's so much information out there. There's, blogs, articles, there's books, there's just, so much stuff. So, if you're not familiar with it, just go and have a quick look. There's 4 different attachment styles. I won't go into it too much. But essentially, what I've tended to notice in my own therapy practice and what I've gathered just by research and reading as well is that a lot of empaths tend to fall more on the anxious side of the spectrum in terms of attachment. So I guess they would fall probably predominantly more into the anxious, preoccupied attachment style. And that makes sense to me, because when you think about what an empath is, an empath, by definition, is somebody who is deeply feeling, sometimes to the point of taking on other people's feelings, sometimes to the point of becoming a bit of a people pleaser, feeling like, they need to step in and save other people. So that's, I guess, maybe the Achilles heel of the empath, or the downside of the empath is it's almost like a transgression of boundaries, so to speak. So, but when you're talking about it in terms of the empath, that's probably more so a byproduct of the fact that the empath is very deeply feeling and can feel other people's feelings pretty quickly. And sometimes gets to the point of overwhelm with other people's feelings and perhaps has trouble identifying their own feelings from somebody else's. So it kind of makes sense that empaths often do fall on the anxious side of the attachment spectrum, because preoccupied anxious, preoccupied people do sometimes have similar traits in terms of, particularly in the relationship context, feeling their partner's emotions quite deeply, being aware of, certain cues to do with emotions, being hypersensitive to it, perhaps falling into the trap of people pleasing, which, again, is another empath trait. So there are some overlaps there, I would suggest. But I think where it differs is that by their inherent nature, an empath has that deeply feeling component where they pick up on other people's emotions. Whereas, as I said before, somebody who's more on the anxious side of the attachment spectrum might pick up on other people's emotions, but it's more likely to be their partner or somebody who's very close to them. And they are particularly sensitive to any sort of signs of that person not being interested in them or withdrawing from them in certain contexts. And of course, this is all on a spectrum. So, it could range from anywhere from very, very mild to perhaps a lot more severe in terms of having pretty significant abandonment triggers with people who are close to them in their life in particular. So that's, I think, a big difference. There's the inherent picking up of other people's emotions, which almost, in the empath at least, feels like it's sort of part of their structural makeup, almost like part of their DNA, so to speak. That might be delving into it a little bit, too deeply, but that's kind of almost how that quality feels. It's like an inherent quality. Whereas, as I said, with the anxious attachment style, it's more kind of an attachment sensitivity, you could put it that way, or an attachment fear, picking up on other people's emotions that are close to them, picking up on subtle cues perhaps that that person is not interested or frustrated with them. But where the two do tend to sort of overlap is just in terms of certain qualities with regards to people pleasing in particular. That's a big one, I think, for both empaths and for both anxiously attached people. Which actually naturally brings me to my next point, which is that another attachment style out of the four that I think empaths can occupy, so to speak, is the fearful avoidant attachment style. And a fearful avoidant, or otherwise known as disorganized attachment, is usually when somebody has had fairly significant trauma in their background, either through past relationships or through their family, or both even. And so it sort of results in this very anxious yet fearful kind of approach to interpersonal relationships and distress. It's kind of like a bit of a push-pull dynamic that tends to play out with partners, with significant others, with people that they're close to, in terms of, I'll let you in to this certain extent, but then when it feels too scary and confronting and I'm afraid I'm going to get hurt, then I might either push you away or chase after you. So it can be tricky. And I'm certainly not making light of it in any way, because I think that can be a very scary and confronting place to be for anyone, and, for partners as well. And it doesn't form for no good reason. And it's a survival strategy. Attachment styles essentially are kind of a survival strategy. So if you've experienced significant trauma in your background, particularly at the hands of a primary caregiver, like a parent, and where you were raised in an unsafe environment, whether that be physically, emotionally, or any other way, or all of the above, then it makes sense that you would, as a young person, as a child even, do whatever you can to try and survive that. And sometimes that means adopting behavioral patterns that, in isolation aren't actually that helpful, but they did actually help you survive a very difficult situation. And therefore, it was an essential survival tactic at the time. It's just that in adult life, that means that those same patterns can play out in interpersonal relationships and cause a lot of difficulties, especially when it's in combination with perhaps a partner who also has that same attachment style, or maybe has an avoidant style, or maybe has an anxious style. It can sort of result in quite a difficult relational dance, or difficult relational patterns, if that makes sense. So all this to say really that there are some empaths who have experienced significant trauma, like anybody, and perhaps have that more fearful, avoidant attachment style. I think that possibly the only attachment style that I don't see being present in, the vast majority of empaths is the avoidance style. In fact, I don't think I've ever come across somebody who identifies as being an empath but also has an avoidant attachment style. And I think the reason for this is because, empaths are deeply feeling people by nature. And avoidant people tend to suppress, withdraw, or avoid from their feelings, and also retreat in different ways from any messy display of emotion, especially conflict with people that they're close to. And, that's not because they don't care about the other person, or they don't care about the situation or resolving the situation. It's more about the fact that they've never been taught to stay present with very big, difficult, messy displays of emotion. And so the default is to withdraw, or leave the situation as a means of self-protection. So it's about self-protection. And to be fair, I think sometimes it's also about protecting the relationship too, because avoidant people understand that if they're caught in a negative spiral with their partner, for example, and the conflict gets really sort of heightened and out of control, then continuing down that path is likely just to damage the relationship further. It could result in them saying or doing something that is really hurtful or that they regret later. So they'd rather put a stop to it, withdraw from the situation, rather than continue and risk damaging a relationship that they most likely care a lot about. So in that way, it can not only be self-protective, but protective of the relationship itself. But back to the topic of avoidance and empaths, I don't think that they coexist, really. But I could be wrong. It's just that I've never come across that. I personally identify, as I said, as an empath. And I also would identify as being more on the anxious side of the attachment spectrum. Although it really does depend as well on who I'm interacting with, who I'm partnering with, as to what side of the continuum I might end up falling on. For example, and this is the case for everybody, for you, for anybody at all. It just really depends on, what's playing out in that particular relationship and what the dynamic is, as to perhaps how anxious you may end up behaving or responding. So if you're paired up with somebody who is very, very avoidant and you are by nature more anxious, you're probably going to end up being really, really, really anxious in that relationship, because, it's almost like a balancing act. It's a mirror image of the other person. And so, attachment styles, whilst usually there is a pretty sort of strong baseline rather, in terms of the kind of attachment style that you have, it can wax and wane and differ according to the sort of relationship you have and the kind of dynamic that keeps playing out. And for me, I tend to keep coming back to that baseline of anxiousness to varying degrees, depending on, again, the relationship that I'm in. So, so it's all very interesting. And again, I'm very curious to know if you have had experience with anyone who identifies as an empath but also has an avoidant attachment style. I'd be very curious to hear about that. Obviously keeping people's identities confidential, so no name dropping or anything like that. But if you or somebody has an avoidant attachment style and identifies an empath, maybe drop a comment below, and I'd be very curious to hear a bit more about it. But yeah, so I think I've covered everything I wanted to for now on that topic. Yeah, I just thought it was incredibly fascinating and a really good companion to the other video I did on narcissists and attachment, which basically was revealing that they don't have an attachment style because they don't attach. And, empaths are, like I've said today, often are more anxious on the spectrum. So that makes a lot of sense in terms of that very unfortunate toxic pairing of narcissists and empaths getting together. One doesn't have an attachment style and doesn't attach. The other feels very deeply, as in the empath, and attaches very, very quickly. And so, it's kind of a cocktail for disaster, essentially. And I did another video called Narcissist and Empath, a Match Made in Hell, which kind of very much exemplifies that exact dynamic. So, and I guess that's another reason why it's pretty important to know what your attachment style is as well, and to know where you fall on the empath versus narcissist versus non-empath spectrum as well. It's all very helpful information. Just to know thyself, essentially, which is, I guess the main thing at the end of the day. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say for now. And thanks so much for listening. If it resonated, maybe give me a thumbs up, share, subscribe if you feel inclined. And I'll talk to you again soon. Thanks so much for listening.